In this 6-week sermon series that we just started last week, we are following the book, Which Way, Lord? Some of you are taking the Bible study, which is on Wednesday mornings and Wednesday nights. Others of you have bought the book and are following along, and others, well, you're just going to get it from our lessons here. We're going to use the life of the Apostle Paul to see what it means to be created for a purpose and what it means to be equipped to live a life of significance while being adaptable to adversity when it comes at us and the detours that we're all going to encounter along the way. So last week we prepared a little bit for knowing that each of us has been given a God-given purpose. And we may not yet know what that purpose is yet, but we have one, I promise you. Each of us has one. And today we're going to take stock of our own lives. Rob Fuquay, the book's author, he compares our lives to a mosaic with many pieces that make up who we are. And our geographic backgrounds are one of the pieces in that mosaic, our family backgrounds, our education, the influence of mentors and relationships along the way that we've had, our difficult and our good experiences in life, our successes, and yes, our failures too, our skills, our passions, and our spiritual gifts, our talents. We are each unique. Each one of us here doesn't have the same set of things that make up the mosaic that we are. Each one has our own unique pattern. No one else has it, and God wants to use all of it for your purpose, the good and the bad. You are a mosaic. Did you know that you are a work of art? Well, last week we talked about Paul. And remember, he was on his way to Damascus. He was a fervent Christian persecutor. And then he was called by Jesus on that road, the bright light. He fell to his knees. He became blind, and Jesus spoke to him. And he became a fervent Christian follower and proponent, willing to give his life for Christ, willing to go to jail. He started churches and he told all the Gentiles about Jesus. He preached to important leaders and people in many different countries. He wrote the books that fill up a good portion of the New Testament. They were letters that he sent, like the one that was just read to you. So why Paul? Why would God just pick out some guy who's out there persecuting Christians and make him the vehicle to talk to famous leaders, to talk to the Gentiles? Why would he be the instrument that God would choose? Why Paul? Well, Paul had the right combination of mosaic pieces in just the right pattern. So let's look at those pieces for just a minute. Let's look at Paul's geographic background. Paul came from a place called Tarsus. That was his hometown. And that was a city that had unique cultural and political realities that helped make Paul who he was. It was a thriving metropolis filled with hardworking people, and tent making was one of their big businesses. And we know that Paul was able to fall back on the skill of tent making as he was going from country to country, and he needed a skill to keep the money coming in so he could survive, and he did tent making. So that was something that God used. And Paul learned a lot from the people of Tarsus. In fact, Alexander the Great once visited, and when he came there, he brought the Greek language, culture, and philosophy to Tarsus. And Paul would have grown up hearing those philosophers. They were great orators, and they would stand on the street corners and gather a crowd, and they would try to persuade the crowd to their particular philosophy. a little bit of something that Paul did later on in life as he went to each city and he would gather a crowd around him and he would use his persuasive skills just like the philosophers did. He learned from them. His geographic background is a part of who he was. How about yours? Where you grew up? The town? Was it a farm? Was it a city? What kind of a place was it? How much influence does where you grew up have on who you are today? Now, you know, Paul had two names, Paul and Saul. He was named the Saul part for the first king of Israel, who was Saul, and that reflects his Hebrew identity. His name was also Paul, reflecting his non-Jewish identity. Now, Paul also inherited from his father his Roman citizenship, and that was a very valuable thing to have that came in really handy when he did all of his ministry. It meant that he could not be arrested without a fair trial, and if he didn't like the results of the trial, he had then the ability to appeal it to a higher authority. That was something that people who were not Roman citizens were not able to do. Sometimes you didn't have a trial and you were just sent to the lions. Off you go. He could also hold office and he could vote on Roman affairs. And his family background, based on that, had an influence on Paul as well. Now, something else, Tarsus was granted free city status by Rome. And that meant that the people in Tarsus, they didn't have to pay taxes. So all the money that they would have paid in taxes, they set aside and they used it for education. Education was really important. It became to the point where Tarsus was able to rival Alexandria and Athens in the education of his people, and Paul, of course, was included in that. So his education impacted who he was too. Not just in Tarsus, but also in Jerusalem. Do you know he went to where his sister lived in Jerusalem and stayed with her and her husband and family so that he could study under a very famous teacher. He wanted to study Jewish law and Jewish scripture so he'd know it inside out, because he loved God very much. Didn't know Jesus yet, but he loved God. And so he was able to tutor under a very famous person, Gamaliel, who was a religious leader and teacher at the time. And I want you to think about something that Gamaliel said, and it's Gamaliel. And tell me if you think this might have had some influence on Paul. Maybe not Saul, but on Paul after he had his transformation. There was discussions among the religious leaders in Jerusalem. What are we going to do with these Christians? And his comment was, well, you know, if this new movement called the Way, if it's really of God, not of God, it's going to fail. It will fail, and it's not a threat. But if it is of God and we fight it, we are fighting with God. Well, his voice of wisdom won out. And that had a lot to do with some of the ways that things went for a while. But what do you think that influence was on Paul, having tutored under that mentor? Stop and think back in your life. Special teacher, someone who mentored you in a job when you first got in that job, a relationship, someone who taught you many things. What are the important influences in your life? Think back. You'd be thinking about all these things as we're talking. Are they a part of who you are today? Now, our bad experiences, they're also a part of who we are, whether we like it or not. Now, in Paul's case, he was probably racked with guilt over his persecution of the Christians after he became one, especially Stephen. And you may remember the story of Stephen. He was the first martyr. And the people laid their cloaks down in front of Paul while they went to throw stones and to stone Stephen to death. So Paul stood there and he was overseeing the execution of Paul. And later, when Saul became Paul, he probably looked back at his career and thought, well, you know, I did that to kind of advance my career, but my goodness, that man Stephen, he was innocent, and I oversaw it. He had to have had guilt. But he knew that Jesus had forgiven him. God would use Paul then to tell other people about what happened that day. God would use that so that he could speak with conviction about how Jesus forgives. You are forgiven through Jesus Christ. God's grace is just amazing. So even our regrets, our mistakes, our failures, God can use them. Don't look back at those things and think that they keep you from being able to be used by God because you did these bad things. And it keeps you from serving out your purpose because they're in the past. But the fact that you remember them and you learned from them, and we'll remember that God has forgiven us, then God can use that. God used everything in Paul's life, and we're going to see that as we study about Paul in the next 4 weeks. God did not want to change Paul. Yes, he changed his direction on that road to Damascus. He went a completely different direction, but God didn't change who he was. Paul was ambitious. He was driven. And after he became a Christian, he was still ambitious, and he was driven. But he became ambitious about Christ. Now, sometimes people are reluctant to serve God because they're afraid that I don't want God to change me. I kind of like who I am the way I am. Do I have to change completely to become a Christian? Well, no. God will change our direction, but God doesn't want to change necessarily who we are. That mosaic of all the things that made us who we are. God just wants to redirect a few things so that you can fully live out your purpose here on this side of heaven. We know that God's Spirit, as you heard in that scripture, gives you gifts, spiritual gifts, talents, to help build up the church. And we have different kinds of gifts and talents. None of us here has the same set. Different kind of gifts, different kinds of service, different kind of ministry. Each of us help to make up the body. The church is the body of Christ. We are the hands and feet of Christ out in the world. But there's one Spirit who distributed all those talents, all those things that we are good at and that come easily to us. That's how you distinguish a talent from a skill. A skill, you learn it, and a talent, if you have a talent for the skill came much more easily. Well, very often, those talents are the things that we become passionate about. So what are the gifts in your life? What are you good at? What are the gifts in your life that will honor God? What are your skills? What are your passions? Each one of those is our piece in the mosaic. Well, I wondered when God called me into ministry, why me, Lord? A pastor? Really? Really? You want me to go back to school after 25 years in business? I got my career path. You want me to go back to school and become a pastor? Why me? Why didn't you let me become a pastor right at the beginning, right after I finished college? Then I could go to seminary and I wouldn't have had to spend all these years in business. I'm getting a late start, God. It soon became evident to me that I needed to live and have the experiences and special skills that took 25 years to develop. And God has not wasted any of it. Looking back now, I can see it. When you're in the middle of it, there was no way that I thought that any of the things that I was doing were going to be used for ministry. I had no idea and would not have believed what God was preparing me for. In business, my background, well, a lot of you know my background is that I'm half Hispanic. I am the daughter of an immigrant. and I speak Spanish fluently, and God used that. I opened up offices all over Latin America in different countries, and I had to be able to do presentations to large groups of people in Spanish. And what you may not realize is that in Latin America, Spanish is not always Spanish. Spanish is different in each country. And you think, well, they're all the same because they all speak Spanish. Well, no, the Spanish is very different in each country. And sometimes the words that seem very normal in one country, they're bad words in another country. And you can stick your foot in your mouth very easily if you don't know that when you travel from country to country. And just like the food, the clothing, the customs, the music, the dancing, it's all completely different from country to country. People say, oh, all of Latin America, it's all the same, they all speak Spanish. They're very, very different people. So you have to learn the differences, and you have to learn to speak a very generic Spanish and avoid the words that you've learned are volatile words. So God used my Spanish heritage, my Spanish language, and my training. And instead of opening up offices in different countries with different cultures and different Spanish, God used me to open up new churches. I was a church planter to open up Hispanic churches that had a mixture of people who came from all these different countries. So I had to pull them together. Even though a lot of their culture was different, their language was different, needed to pull them together. And I needed to be able to preach to them without inserting some bad words into my sermons. It would have made them very interesting. Those are landmines. And I had to adapt my message to the multitude of cultures of the people in front of me. So I also, thinking back, realized that my business background came in handy in being a pastor. Most people don't realize how much time a pastor has to spend in administration of a church. They don't teach you that in seminary, unfortunately. And a pastor friend of mine who had no experience at all, just book knowledge of scriptures and worship, but no experience in business. And in one of his churches, he had no clue, but the bookkeeper was embezzling $40,000 from the church under his watch, and he didn't catch it until later. He has since taken classes and gotten himself educated to avoid that ever happening. But that was something that I already had before I came in here. God was using it. Second career pastor, God used everything. So then I stop and think of experiences that I've had in life. I'm going to throw out an example so maybe you can think back on your life of some pivotal things, pivotal moments in your life. But one that comes to mind was when I was 13 years old, I went snow skiing and I broke both my legs. And I had casts on fully all the way down the length. I spent almost a year in bed. I had to deal with bedpans and wheelchairs and all the stuff that comes along with that. And afterwards, with months of physical therapy, I had to learn to walk all over again. I had to have braces on both legs. And a lot of good stuff came out of that very bad experience. One of the things was I learned to look at the world from the outside in, because suddenly I wasn't in the midst of all my friends and all the things that they were doing. And I got to look at them from the outside, and I got to see how immature and stupid a lot of the things were that we were doing as teenagers at that time. And it really helped adjust my way of thinking. And today, I use that same strategy, pull myself back when I get so immersed in the middle of a problem, pull myself back and look at it. Also, I got a lot closer to my parents during that time because I was with them 24 hours, my mom anyway. And what I didn't know was that my own daughter, many years later, would be born with a type of dwarfism that requires surgery on the legs. So twice she had leg surgery where she had casts on full length of her legs. And I could empathize, and I knew exactly how she felt and what she was going through. And little did I know that I would go into ministry. Whoever thought that I would be visiting people regularly in the hospital who've had broken legs, hip fractures, many needing rehab, just like I did. Again, I know what it feels like, and I can empathize with that feeling. As we sit and pray, I've been there. So how about you? Are you using any of your past experiences in life to help others or to serve? How about your spiritual gifts, your talents, your skills, your passions in life? Is God using who you are today and what you have experienced for His purpose for your life? For example, if you've lost a loved one, you've gone through a very painful process of grieving and loss. Now, you can be a great help to someone else who's going through it more recently. Have you had a loved one with dementia? How you dealt with and coped with that is something that may help a friend who is either developing dementia themselves or coping with the caregiving of someone with dementia. You know what it's like to be the tireless caregiver, and maybe you could fill in for a spell and give them a break. Retired people with a wealth of life experiences to share can do many things. Do you have a financial background? You can help the church with our finance team or counting money. Do you have experience in teaching, which can be used to tutor young people today or help with children and youth in our programs here at the church? Are you creative and a good decorator? You could come and help get this sanctuary made to look beautiful for Christmas or for Thanksgiving or Easter. Are you good at cooking? Have you learned to cook over the years? Maybe you were a stay-at-home mom, but you learned to cook fabulous meals. You could come and help us with our events that we have here. Or do you know we may be starting to cook some meals for the FGCU College? They have a ministry there for college kids, and they're looking for churches to provide a meal when they have their weekly worship and meal. If you want to know God's purpose for you on this earth, one of the first steps to take is to take stock of your life. Figure out who you are and how you got there. All the things we've talked about, think of those things and then pray for a willing heart to serve. Pray for God to speak to you and to tell you what your purpose is, to open doors and to guide you on how all those mosaic pieces fit together and why they fit together that way. Next week, we're going to explore a little bit more on what your purpose truly is. In November, we are going to explore our spiritual gifts more fully. Everybody in the congregation is going to take a spiritual gifts inventory to help you figure out what that is. In the meantime, be giving some thought to the things we've talked about today. Who are you, and how will you serve out your purpose? Now, I have a prayer that I was going to have us read, but the font is too small on the screen, so I'm going to read it, and if you would just close your eyes and kind of pray with me. Dear God, I believe you have a purpose for my life. I know I am fearfully and wonderfully made, and more important, that any work I do for you is the work that you want to do in me. So I offer you my life, since it belongs to you anyway. Help me to listen well, so I can hear when you call. Help me discern, so I can sense your leading. And help me to follow, so when you tell me to go, I will have already said yes. Amen.